Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 213 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today I have with me Carlos Ayres. Carlos is a partner at Trench Rossi in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and he visits with us about the Brazilian Clean Companies Act and the recent guidance given by the Brazilian government on that. He also talks about the current state of anti-corruption compliance in Brazil. The episode comes in at just over 22 minutes. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I'm very fortunate to have Carlos Ayres. Carlos is a partner at Trench Rossi in Sao Paulo, and he has taken kindly enough, given me some time to visit with me about some of the ongoings of anti-corruption compliance enforcement and practice in Sao Paulo. So with that, Carlos, welcome and thank you.
Hi Tom, thank you for having me today here with you.
Carlos, one of the things that intrigued me is you recently wrote a post on the FCPA Americas blog, which you work on with Matt Ellis, and it involved guidance given around the Brazilian Clean Companies Act. And you were kind enough to write an article in English for we Americans who don't happen to read Portuguese. But I was wondering if you might be able to give us some of the highlights, at least the highlights you saw in the guidance around the Clean Companies Act.
Sure, absolutely, Tom. The CGU, the Office of the Controller General, the entity that the executive federal level has jurisdiction to enforce the Clean Companies Act, passed these guidelines that helps entities to understand the requirements and what the authorities are expecting in terms of compliance program, right? So earlier this year, Brazil passed a decree 8420, that sets forth 16 elements of a compliance program. In fact, Brazil did not reinvent the wheel, right? Brazil used the resource guide of the FCPA, the US sentence guidelines, and the UK Bribery Act guidance as a reference, and then this new guidance that came up late in September gives some light in terms of the compliance program. So similarly to the FCPA guidance, the guidance published by CGU is not binding and is organized around five major pillars, which are commitment and support from high-level management. The second element is the adequacy, authority, and autonomy of the compliance function. The third element is risk assessment. The fourth is corporate compliance policies and procedures, and the last one is continuous monitoring. One important aspect that the guidance clarifies from the outset is the scope of compliance programs, because as you are familiar, the scope of the Brazil's Clean Companies Act covers not only corruption but other frauds and other acts committed against the public administration that are not necessarily linked to corruption, right? So the guidance clarifies that, and they make an express reference that companies that have a compliance program designed to prevent bribery, especially to comply with foreign legislation, they might need to revisit their compliance programs in order to make the adjustments that might be necessary. One interesting aspect is that the guidance says that companies should look for and monitor corporate goals. So many times employees, they have tasks that are very hard to fulfill, or instructions that they receive for the managers that go out there and do whatever is necessary. So it tells companies that they have to monitor these very carefully, make sure that the goals that are put to employees are something that it's feasible to be achieved, and following the rules. Also, the guidance gives some clarification on books and records, because different from the FCPA, in which just the issuers need to have and to comply with the books and records provisions. Under the guidance, any company operating in Brazil should have policies to address books and records and internal controls. So essentially it says that the documentation should reflect what happened. So if you're hiring a company or a third party, the scope should be clear, there should be deliverables. So that's in terms of the books and records. In terms of internal controls, the guidance says that companies should be paying attention to changes in revenue, for example, when the company does business in the private sector and then all of a sudden it sees an increase in sales to public entities, or perhaps if the company already does business with public entity, then there is a significant increase in a specific region. So what is the reason behind that? Or in another aspect, the guidance also mentions, for example, instances in which the company was paying tax and all of a sudden the payment of tax decreased. So what was the reason behind that? There might be legitimate reasons, like the company obtained some sort of tax exemption, but what is behind that? So
one of the things that struck me, particularly in your article, the blog post, was the suggestion from the guidance that companies actually look at the profit margins in each contract. That if a profit from one contract is very high, what is the reason? And so it seemed to me to be requiring or giving very good guidance on some of the specific things companies need to do to be in compliance with the law.
Yes, and that's looking at the margin is very important, especially in certain industries like IT, pharmaceutical, in which the margin is very high, right, compared to other sectors. And then, and we don't see these days instances in which the person goes to the treasurer or the finance department and say, hey, give me 50,000 reais because I'm gonna use. No, at the end of the day, they give extra discounts that are then passed to distributors, for example, that we use that margin to pay bribes. So it's very important for companies to look at margin, not only before approving the deal, having a rationale on why that extra margin is necessary, but after, but also looking at the deal after the transaction was completed, because many times there is, for example, requirements for extra discount because there is a justification that competitor X, Y, and Z will participate in a tender, for example. But when you look at the minutes of the tender afterwards, you realize that those competitors did not participate. So what was done with the extra discount? Was that passed to the end user? Was kept? What was done with that? So that's an important aspect to look at. Another point that I would like to highlight is that the guidance gives some additional detail for the hotlines. In addition to say that the hotlines should be open not only for employees but also for third parties, it mentions that the hotline should be also used as a tool for employees to be able to call and ask questions or address any doubts that they have. So it's an important thing. And also the guidance mentioned at different sections the importance of conducting internal investigations, not only as part of remediation, but also for the company to learn about the facts so that it can then decide to what to do in terms of the information that the company collected, including deciding to self-disclose and cooperate. And one important thing to mention, I think, especially for many companies in the US and elsewhere, is that CGU is working on an official translation of the guidance into Portuguese in English, and is expected to be released in the near future. And also there is, I believe I saw on the internet already a translation of the guidance available. So I encourage everyone to go and read it, because it provides very practical information for companies doing business in Brazil.
Yes, there's a company in the United States called Merrill Brink that translated the guidance and put that copy on their website, and I would like to thank them for sharing that information from us, because I was really intrigued when I read the guidance, the translated version, of the level of, I would say, specificity, but the level of detail in the guidance down to, that's why I raised the question to you about looking at the contract margins to see if something was unusual. So very congratulations to the CGU for putting out such detailed guidance for compliance practitioners. If I could change the subject a little bit now, because one of the things that has intrigued me about the current state of anti-corruption in Brazil is how businesses have responded to the ongoing scandals involving Petrobras. And I don't mean to get into what's going on with Petrobras, except that it seems that they are now requiring their contractors to have compliance programs in place. And then perhaps their direct contractors will also make the same requirements below them, so that it will drive compliance down the chain. Is that something that you are seeing at all as a business response to compliance?
Yes, I think this started in the recent past. My perspective is that this started with the IT industry, that they were involved in some case in the recent past, and then they are pushing their distributors and resellers to have compliance programs so they can do business with these multinationals. So I think your point is right. We are seeing a change. I think until the recent past, compliance programs were seen first as a cost, right, by the executives, then as a line of defense in order to mitigate risks. And I think what we are seeing now is that the compliance programs are also becoming a competitive advantage. So the companies, in order to do business, especially with larger corporations, they will have to have a compliance program in place, and these companies are starting to audit their distributors and resellers and some of the suppliers as well. So I think there is a change in the environment right now. I think it will still take time until that is developed, but I think it's a turning point, let's say, at the Brazilian community in terms of the way of doing business.
Carlos, as I understand it, you have been in generally working in the area of anti-corruption compliance for several years, perhaps as far back as 2007. Could you tell us some of the changes you have seen over the years in terms of attitudes toward compliance and how things are really changing here in Brazil?
Yes. Well, I started to work with compliance and anti-corruption focus full-time in 2007, and at that time not many people were interested on that. You would go and talk to companies, not many of them realize the importance. And I think the change in the culture, I would say, not in the culture, but in the country, I think there are different reasons for that. First of all, I think it's the strong enforcement. The Brazilian authorities have been enforcing our anti-corruption laws very vigorously. So between 2008 and 2013, the number of individuals arrested for crimes against the public administration involving primarily corruption, right, increased 133%. In addition to that, Brazil passed new legislation, so the Clean Companies Act is one of them. There were changes in the money laundering law. Brazil has been fighting corruption not only in passing new legislation, enforcing laws, but also giving transparency. So basically right now at the federal government level, any contract is public online almost on the next day after it was signed, and there is information about the expenditures, salaries of public employees. So with all of them, Brazil is closing ranks against corruption, right? And we also see a significant increase in cooperation with foreign authorities. So putting all of them together, I think caused the Brazilian business community to start to look at compliance. And I think we have this strong enforcement. Then the Clean Companies Act was passed, which for the first time with respect to anti-corruption gave credit for companies that have a compliance program in place, because before that, even if a company had a state-of-art compliance program, it would get no credit for it. So then it also stimulates companies to have compliance program. So I would say first you have strong enforcement, then you have new legislation, and then third, now you have like this environment in which many companies are requiring their third parties to have compliance program in place so that they can do business with them.
And from my perspective, it's really that third part, when businesses start to require compliance, that really drives compliance. Because you mentioned having a competitive advantage, that if a distributor wants to work with an American company, certainly they'd have a competitive advantage to already have a compliance program in place. And now it may be that a distributor would have a competitive advantage to do business with other Brazilian companies as well.
Yes, I agree with you. At the end of the day, that's one of the important aspects, because when businesses started to see that they are losing money, right, because they do not have a compliance program, that makes a very quick change in the mindset, right? So they look to implement, and we see that because until the recent past, it was the companies that were subject to the FCPA and UK Bribery Act that had compliance programs in place. And now we are starting to see mid-size Brazilian local companies that just have operations in Brazil looking for compliance programs. So it's a change in the culture. Right?
And I think it's a change in the culture much for the better. And I certainly applaud the efforts that you and your colleagues have engaged in. One of the things that I found also interesting is, could you describe the compliance team that you and your partners and your law firms have in place? Because I was very intrigued when you described that. So could you describe how many lawyers you have and what they're doing and how you go about doing it, and what are the services you offer in the area of compliance in addition to just investigations?
Sure, and I think that also represents how this is changing in Brazil, right? So we started that group, our compliance and investigations group, started as a group in 2003, and we are now 4 partners, and we have 63 associates that are dedicated full-time to compliance work, which includes conducting Internal investigations is one aspect of our work. The second piece of work is the implementation of compliance programs, conducting risk assessments, creating and developing policies and procedures tailored to the specific companies, conducting and developing training. That's the second piece, I would say, in terms of compliance. And then the third piece of work that we do is due diligence of third parties, and especially in M&A transactions, because of the new law, which has the notion of successor liability. We see a lot of work in that area as well. It's something that we have been doing a lot. And the fourth aspect of our work in our group is to do the representation of the companies before the authorities. So it's a strong practice that we have, and we have been doing that for many years now.
Carlos, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I was wondering if someone wanted to contact you to follow up on anything you said, could they email you, and if so, how would they do it?
Sure, absolutely. If you would like to further discuss any aspect, anyone listening to this podcast, feel free to reach me at my email. It's carlos.ayres, AYRES, at trenchrossi.com.
And of course, I have to ask you about the FCPA America, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the FCPA America's blog, it's something that Matt and I put a lot of energy.
Matt who?
Matt Ellis and we put a lot of energy. It's very grateful because people read and they reach out to us to comment, and we inspire a lot on your own posts, Don. So it's good to have you and your posts as guidance for us as well. So.
Well, my only complaint is you do not post enough blog posts. So please write more in 2016. You and Matt, I think, are the source for information for compliance south of the United States border. It's Mexico, Central America, and Latin America, and I look forward to reading more of your things. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the opportunity to speak here, and we will do much better next year.
Great. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox again, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have a couple of requests for you. First of all, I'm developing a list of questions for my next mailbag episode, so if you have any questions you'd like explored, please give me a shout. You can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. The second thing is, if you would go to iTunes and rate this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it, and it would certainly help get the message out. Once again, thank you for listening. I look forward to visiting with you again.